Listen closely, because what I'm about to whisper into your mind was never meant to leave the stone walls of New Orleans in 1709. A convent that still casts its shadow today held a secret so vicious, so unspeakable, that even the priests who blessed its ground begged God for permission to forget. Imagine the sound of nails scratching against wood from beneath the floorboards, muffled sobs blending with prayers that turned to screams, until silence was forced not by forgiveness but by soil. They say silence was the virtue demanded, yet silence became the grave. Young girls, cloaked in the innocence of their vows, were sealed alive beneath the convent for breaking the one rule they should never have broken, speaking of what they had seen. The church painted them as disobedient, cursed with temptation. But the truth? They had witnessed something they were never supposed to describe. Something about the sisters, the rituals, the black candles glowing in chapels that should have been drenched in holy light. This is not just a ghost story. This is about control. About silence as a weapon. About how institutions bury truth the same way they bury bodies, deep, layered, and sealed tight, so only the brave dare to dig. And tonight you and I were digging. The convent's records insist on order, on obedience, on purity. But those pages hide more than they reveal. Why would so many young girls, sent from wealthy French families across the ocean, vanish without a trace? The official word was always the same: illness, fever, accidents. Yet no graves were marked, no families were called to mourn. Whispers spread through the French Quarter, whispers that still echo centuries later. That beneath the convent floorboards were not relics of saints but bones. Bones of daughters sacrificed not to God but to silence. Think carefully about this. What kind of institution must fear words so much that it kills the very mouths that dare to speak them? What were they speaking of? A bishop who touched without mercy? Priests who wandered the halls after midnight? Or rituals the church never admitted existed? Latin chants twisted into invocations, power masquerading as piety? You see, when silence is enforced through terror, truth becomes poison to the powerful. And the dead, those girls entombed alive, became both the warning and the wall. Speak, and you too will be buried where no light reaches. But here is the deeper terror, the one that stains your thoughts long after the story ends. What if the girls weren't only punished for speaking, but chosen for silence because of what they carried within? Secrets about bloodlines, about alliances between church leaders and men who controlled the ports, the plantations, the trafficking of souls. This convent was more than a house of worship. It was a vault, a gatekeeper of deals forged in shadows. Girls from noble French families were not just educated here, they were groomed, prepared, and in some cases silenced permanently when they saw too much. Their blood was currency, their silence a contract. Some say the sisters themselves were not innocent lambs of Christ but wolves wearing the habit. Women who obeyed not heaven but a darker oath hidden beneath layers of holy cloth. Imagine being 16, hearing whispers through the stone at night, voices chanting not prayers but bargains. Would you tell? Would you risk speaking? Or would you lock it inside you, even as the knowledge hollowed you out? Remember this: silence is not absence. Silence is control, shaped into chains you cannot see. The more we peel away, the more we see how silence itself was weaponized as a ritual. The girls were buried alive not only to punish, but to feed the myth of obedience. To bury one alive is to make her death echo for generations. Every girl who heard the scratching beneath the chapel floorboards understood the lesson. And every family who questioned was met with sealed doors and a priest's cold assurance: she is with God now. But was she? Or was she pressed against earth and wood, lungs burning, heart pounding, begging for the air she would never breathe again? These deaths were sacrifices, not to God but to the institution's survival. You must understand, power survives by creating fear so complete that people police themselves. The convent did not need chains on every girl. It only needed 1 or 2 graves to make every survivor their own jailer. This is how control works. It doesn't silence everyone. It convinces you to silence yourself. And here comes the shadow that touches you right now across centuries. Do you think this was only 1709? Do you think the practice of enforced silence died with the screams beneath the convent? No. It shifted, it disguised itself, but it never ended. The mechanism is eternal. Punish one, control 100. Destroy a voice, create a silence that lasts centuries. The convent's buried girls became the archetype of obedience, the living example of what happens when you dare to unveil secrets. And even now, when you hear of whistleblowers vanishing, of journalists silenced, of truths covered by polite words and sealed documents, you are staring at the same machine that buried those girls alive. The soil has changed. The stone has changed. But the silence is the same. If you felt it, if you've seen truths twisted into graves, then you already understand why you are here listening to this. Because tonight, you are not just hearing a story. You are stepping into the forbidden space where silence cracks, and something buried long ago begins to claw its way back to the surface. The convent walls were thick, not just to hold prayer but to hold secrets. When night fell, the sisters barred the gates, sealing themselves in. Locals whispered that if you walked past at midnight, you could hear two sets of sounds, chants rising from the chapel and muffled cries from beneath the ground. The duality of devotion and damnation. But what terrified people most was the feeling, an invisible pressure in the air, as if the stones themselves remembered what they were forced to contain. Imagine living in a city where sacred bells rang at dawn, yet beneath them rotting flesh murmured a different gospel. The people knew but dared not say. And here lies the brilliance of control. You don't need to hide the truth completely. You just need to teach people that speaking it will cost them everything. So the convent became untouchable, a fortress not only of nuns, but of silence itself. And the girls who vanished? They became both warning and legend. And every time a family sent a daughter to the convent, they prayed not for her soul, but for her survival. The archives tell us that in 1709, several ships arrived from France carrying daughters of nobles, destined for convent life. Yet the number recorded as arriving is greater than the number recorded as leaving. Where did they go? Historians brush it off as record-keeping errors, but listen to the old French quarter gossip, echoes passed down through generations. They speak of wooden boxes carried into the ground at night, too small to hold coffins, too heavy to be empty. They speak of sisters instructing silence with eyes colder than the blade of a knife. And they speak of the bishop himself ordering special bricks imported, bricks that sealed tighter, locked in sound. If the dead could scream forever, he wanted those screams smothered. Think of it. Every missing number in those records is not a mistake. It's a buried life, a silenced witness. And if the official records themselves were corrupted, then what you read in history books is not history. It is propaganda. It is the official silence, the same silence that smothered lungs in the dark beneath holy stone. But here's where the blade turns. What if the silence wasn't just punishment? What if it was ritual? You see, across Europe, whispers of certain sects within the church spoke of living interment, not just as punishment but as offering. To trap a soul between life and death, sealed in a tomb of wood and earth, was to create a conduit, a channel of power. Priests and sisters could draw from that agony, siphon devotion from despair. And New Orleans, even in its infancy, was a crossroads of energies. African, indigenous, French, Spanish. A city already alive with blood, ritual, and crossroads magic. What if the convent didn't simply silence girls? What if it harvested them? Their breath becoming prayer, their screams becoming incantations, their slow deaths feeding an order that cloaked itself in purity? Think of the psychology. To tell the world you are married to Christ but secretly feeding on his lambs. That is not devotion. That is domination. That is a machine not of faith but of power. Now let me turn the lantern toward you. Have you ever felt it? That crushing pressure when you dared to speak something forbidden? That sudden fear that someone would hear, someone would punish? That is the same energy. The girls buried in the convent are not just history, They are archetype. Their silence carved into the human psyche like scars across flesh. Institutions learned the lesson. Bury one alive, silence 10,000. And so silence was baked into schools, into churches, into governments. Ask yourself, why do you swallow words? Why do you choke on truths you know you should speak? Because the system taught you to. The convent was only one chapter in a book written across centuries. And every time you feel that fear of speaking, you are feeling the echo of nails scratching wood, lungs gasping, girls suffocating in darkness. Their silence has become yours. Their grave has become your throat. This story isn't about them alone. It's about how the silence was passed to you like inheritance. And if you don't recognize it, you'll pass it on again. And yet, buried in this nightmare lies a darker twist. Because some say the girls did not die in silence. Some say their spirits lingered, clawing through generations. Witnesses tell of sisters waking with bruises around their necks, marks of strangulation. Priests found gasping in their sleep, choking on phantom hands. The convent's silence was never perfect. For every voice buried, a whisper escaped. For every grave sealed, a shadow slipped out. Locals avoided the convent, claiming to see pale figures at the windows, girls whose lips moved though no sound emerged. And here's the cruel irony. The institution that buried them alive could not bury what they became. The silence itself grew teeth. Those girls, those daughters who refused to vanish, became something else. Not saints, not martyrs, but reminders. And to this day, if you walk past the old convent walls in New Orleans, you may feel them pressing against you, warning you, daring you. Do not let silence claim you the way it claimed us. Their graves may be hidden, but their lesson is not. Their lesson waits for you. To understand why girls were buried alive in New Orleans, you must strip away the lace and ritual and stare at the machinery beneath. This was not simply religion, it was politics. In 1709, Louisiana was still fragile, a colony carved from swamps and shadows. France needed to keep its grip. And what better tool of control than the church? The convent became more than sanctuary, it became the perfect vault for secrets. Daughters of nobles and merchants carried more than innocence, they carried alliances. By silencing them, the church secured favors, erased scandals, sealed business deals. Imagine a young girl discovering that her family's fortune wasn't built on trade alone, but on flesh, slaves carried through New Orleans' bloody port. She threatens to write a letter, to speak. The solution is simple: silence her forever. Bury the girl, protect the family, preserve the power. The soil beneath the convent became not just a graveyard, but a filing system, where inconvenient truths were archived in flesh. Every scream stifled was another contract sealed, another alliance protected. Think about who benefited most. The governor's mansion and the bishop's palace were only streets apart, bound not by faith but by necessity. The church needed protection from scrutiny, the governor needed legitimacy. And in between stood the convent, swallowing problems whole. Priests were not just priests, they were brokers, masking transactions with scripture. And the girls? They were currency. Their silence bought favors, covered crimes, erased whispers that could destabilize the colony. But here's the twist: the locals knew. The fishermen, the enslaved, the women who sold herbs in the markets. They knew something rotted beneath those whitewashed walls. They didn't need records, they felt it in the air. And they spread it through story, keeping the truth alive even when the institution tried to bury it. That is why this tale survived centuries. Not because the church admitted it, but because the people refused to let silence reign completely. And now you too become part of that resistance, because by hearing this, you are inheriting a truth that was never meant to be spoken aloud. The most chilling part? The silence worked both ways. The convent demanded the girls never speak, but it also demanded their families remain silent. Wealthy parents who suspected the truth were trapped. To accuse the church was to risk ruin, excommunication, even charges of heresy. So they swallowed their grief, dressed it in polite phrases, She is with God now. Imagine the psychology, your daughter buried alive, and you forced to kneel at the very altar that ordered it. That is not faith. That is psychological warfare. The convent turned parents into accomplices, teaching them to silence themselves, to teach future generations that questioning power is dangerous. Do you see the brilliance? By turning grief into obedience, the system fed itself. And the families, bound by fear and reputation, became as complicit as the ones who wielded the shovel. This is how silence metastasizes, until entire societies live in graves of unspoken truth, breathing but never free. And yet cracks formed. Whispers bled through. In 1720, just a decade later, a visiting French officer recorded strange customs in the convent, noting that several girls disappeared without report. His words were buried in archives, dismissed as exaggeration. But why record them at all unless something gnawed at him? This is the pattern: fragments, pieces, shadows. Enough to unsettle, but never enough to break the silence completely. And that is the danger. You don't need complete control to rule. You just need doubt. You just need fear strong enough that people dismiss the fragments as rumor. Because what is rumor if not truth smothered but still breathing? You're seeing how the system works, aren't you? Truth is not erased. It is discredited, mocked, framed as madness so the institution can go on burying what it wishes. And every time you've doubted your own perception, every time you've swallowed your suspicion, realize you are replaying the same script that was written in the soil beneath that convent. But here we cross into the truly forbidden. Because buried within this silence is not just the story of the girls, but of the rituals the church was desperate to hide. Records hint at night masses not sanctioned by Rome, lit by black candles, drenched in strange hymns. Witnesses claimed the sisters drew symbols on the floors that were neither crosses nor saints, but something older, something imported from occult sects in Europe. Could it be that the girls weren't silenced for gossip or scandal, but because they stumbled onto ceremonies meant to bind the city itself? Imagine young novices wandering after curfew, seeing their holy mothers, chanting in languages never heard in Mass, cutting palms, smearing blood across the altar. Do you understand now? Silence was not just discipline, it was protection. Protection for rituals older than the city, darker than the church. Rituals that turned every buried girl into not only a warning but an offering. And the silence wasn't only about what they saw. It was about what they interrupted. Silence is never just the absence of words, it is architecture. It is built, brick by brick, until entire generations live inside it without even knowing. The convent of 1709 was not only a physical prison but a psychological blueprint. Think of it. The buried girls taught fear to the living girls taught obedience to the families taught reverence to the community. And from community, silence spread into culture. This is how power metastasizes. It does not need chains on every wrist, only terror planted in a few graves to ripple outwards. And you watching this now, you feel it. You've swallowed truths in your own life. You've hidden thoughts, denied instincts, pretended blindness because the cost of speaking felt too high. That is the echo of 1709. That is how the past lives inside you, controlling you in ways you never even noticed. Until you notice, you are just another silent witness, alive but buried. The convent's silence was so effective because it hijacked the deepest instincts of the human mind. We are tribal creatures. We crave belonging. And nothing terrifies us more than exile. When the convent buried a girl alive, they weren't just killing her, they were exiling her in the most absolute way. She was cut off from the tribe, from family, from even the dignity of a marked grave. That image seared itself into the collective psyche of everyone who survived. Obey or you too will be erased. And this is not unique to 1709. Governments, corporations, and institutions still weaponize this today. Exile takes new forms: public shaming, blacklisting, digital erasure. You don't need to bury bodies when you can bury reputations. But the psychology is identical. That's why when you feel fear about speaking truth, your heart races as if you're standing before a grave. Because the same system that ruled that convent rules you. Different costumes, same play. Now listen carefully, because this is where the descent becomes dangerous. The buried girls did not die in vain. They became symbols, not of obedience but of awakening. Their screams beneath the soil turned into vibrations that never stopped. And you can feel them now, can't you? That pressure in your chest, that realization that silence is not safety, silence is slow death. This is the turning point. If you are still here, it means you're ready to break the chain. And to prove it, I want you to leave your mark right now. Comment the phrase twice. I break the silence. Not once, twice. Because repetition is ritual, and ritual rewires the mind. By typing it, you are declaring war against the centuries-old system that taught you to swallow your truth. You are refusing the grave. Do it not just for you, but for the girls whose nails clawed wood in the dark, whose lungs burned while priests chanted above them. Their silence fed the machine. Your voice breaks it. But do not mistake this for simple rebellion. Breaking silence comes at a price. The buried girls knew that, and so must you. Every time you speak truth in a world built on lies, you risk exile. Friends may mock you. Systems may punish you. Authorities may dismiss you. That is by design. Because silence protects the powerful and truth weakens them. But here lies the secret. The system only works if you believe you are alone. You are not. The moment you comment, the moment you speak, you connect with every other awakened voice. You form a counter-tribe, a new lineage, one that cannot be buried. The convent depended on isolation. But you are refusing to be isolated. And once you realize that, the grave loses its power. Because silence only buries the solitary. The united cannot be silenced. So now ask yourself, what secrets in your own life have you been forced to bury? What truths lie rotting under the floorboards of your own mind? The story of 1709 is not just a historical horror, it is a mirror. The convent walls stand inside you. The buried girls breathe inside your memory. And every time you choke back a truth, you are placing another stone atop their grave. But every time you speak, you are pulling those stones down, letting the buried climb into daylight. This is the psychological war you were born into. And this channel, this voice you are hearing, is not here to entertain you. It is here to train you. To strip illusions, to expose the scaffolding of silence, to awaken that part of you that institutions have spent centuries trying to suffocate. So subscribe right now, because this is only the beginning. And understand, by subscribing you are choosing the descent. You are choosing to hear what others fear. And once you step fully in, there is no way back. Beneath the convent's stone floors, below the chapel where holy hymns echoed, there were chambers few were ever meant to see. Some called them storage vaults. Others said they were crypts. But the whispers, the ones passed down through families who dared not write them, spoke of something else. Ritual rooms. The walls scratched with symbols not found in scripture. Candles melted in patterns that mapped stars older than Christianity itself. Silence here was not simply punishment, it was invocation. The buried girls became living sacrifices, their terror woven into chants that bled through the city's foundation. And ask yourself, why New Orleans? Why would such a city so young already need such rituals? Because New Orleans was destined to be a crossroads, a port not only of trade but of souls. Whoever controlled its silence controlled its future. And those girls, trapped between breath and death, became unwilling gatekeepers, keys carved from suffering. Records tell of shipments arriving from France marked as religious artifacts. But what relic requires secrecy, smuggled in at night, carried straight into the convent cellars? Some speculate bones, not of saints but of something older, darker, bones used to consecrate the ground beneath the convent. Imagine the horror, girls buried alive not only to silence them, but to bind their souls to relics buried beside them. To make the silence eternal, to chain the scream into stone. And if this sounds impossible, remember, The church itself often co-opted pagan practices, masking them in holy robes. What if New Orleans convent was not an outlier, but a perfect fusion? Catholic ritual on the surface, occult engineering beneath. Silence became more than absence. It became fuel. It became a living resource the church could harvest. Every muffled cry, every nail dragged across coffin wood fed the machine. And to this day the ground around that convent feels heavy, as though silence itself was weaponized there. But the darkest revelations never come from enemies of the church. They come from within. Hidden in a private letter from a visiting Jesuit priest was a phrase that has haunted scholars. They silenced the lambs to awaken the wolves. What did he mean? Some believe he stumbled upon a secret order within the convent, one not loyal to Rome but to something far older. These wolves were not men of God, but keepers of a tradition where suffering was transmuted into power. The silence of buried girls was their offering, their fuel. And here lies the twist. Perhaps those nuns were not victims of corruption. Perhaps they were initiates of a lineage that knew silence itself could bend human will. The priest never spoke of it again. His letter was buried in archives, left to rot. But the phrase lingers, silence awakens wolves. And if true, then every grave dug beneath that convent was not just a crime, it was a ceremony. Think of the psychology again. If you can bury someone alive, and through their silence create fear, you control bodies. But if you can bury someone alive, and through their silence draw power, you control souls. This is where the institution transcends corruption and enters sorcery. Silence becomes a possession, a force that inhabits you, shapes your thoughts, bends your will. And here's the chilling part, you have felt it. That moment when you wanted to speak truth but something inside clamped down, as if a hand pressed over your mouth. That is silence as possession. It is not just your fear, it is the echo of centuries, the residue of rituals where silence itself was bound to human flesh. And if you never resist it, then you are not only obedient, you are possessed. The convent girls were not the only ones buried alive. The silence buried you too. But in the cracks of this nightmare lies another secret, one the church could not fully control. Some of the buried girls did not fade quietly. Some fought. Their nails carved words into wood. Their screams left impressions, vibrations that tore into the stone itself. And over generations, those vibrations resurfaced as hauntings. Sisters reported hearing whispers from beneath their feet, words they could not understand. Families of priests described madness, hallucinations, even violent deaths after serving in the convent too long. Silence is never perfect. Energy cannot be destroyed. What was buried clawed its way back. And this is why the convent, even after centuries, remains one of New Orleans' most feared sites. Because silence does not stay buried. It rots, it swells, it breaks stone. And when it rises, it does not come back as innocence. It comes back as vengeance. You may be asking, what does this have to do with you, here now, centuries later? The answer, everything. The convent was not just an isolated horror. It was a prototype, a test, a demonstration of how silence could be enforced so deeply that it outlives death. Today the forms have changed, but the mechanism is identical. Instead of burying girls alive beneath chapel floors, systems bury people in paperwork, lawsuits, character assassinations, digital blackouts. The grave is not wood and soil anymore. It is a courtroom, a headline, an algorithm. Speak the wrong truth and you find yourself erased, not physically but socially, financially, digitally. Tell me, is that any less a grave? You scroll past it every day, someone silenced, their truth dismissed. And every time you swallow your suspicion, every time you avoid asking questions, you lay another handful of dirt on their coffin. The system doesn't need to bury bodies anymore. It has perfected the art of burying voices. But here lies the darker genius. In 1709, the convent needed to make silence visible. The girls buried alive were a warning, a spectacle for those who whispered too loudly. Today, silence is invisible. It happens in shadows, behind screens, inside algorithms you never see. A journalist suddenly disappears from mainstream coverage. A whistleblower's story is buried under scandal and distraction. You don't see their body, you see their reputation shredded. And this invisibility is more effective than the convent ever dreamed. Because when silence is invisible, people no longer even recognize it as silence. They call it coincidence, irrelevance, madness. That's how powerful the ritual has become. The buried girls cried out, and the community could hear the muffled echoes beneath the floorboards. But when silence is engineered digitally, you don't hear anything. You don't even know the screams exist. And that, my friend, is the perfected grave. Think of your own life. How many truths have you buried inside yourself? Not because anyone nailed the coffin shut, but because you learned early, speaking costs too much. Maybe it was in school when raising your hand earned mockery. Maybe it was in your family where asking why drew only anger. Maybe it was in your work where pointing out corruption risked your livelihood. These are not accidents. These are modern convents. Every authority, every system you've served has taught you that silence is safety, that swallowing your truth keeps you alive. But what is survival if it demands burial of your soul? That's not life, that's slow suffocation. And if you can feel that truth trembling in your chest now, then you know you've been buried alive all along. Not in wood, not in soil, but in fear. And this is where the descent sharpens. Are you willing to claw out even if it costs you? Look at governments. Look at corporations. Look at the way they shape narratives. When a scandal breaks, silence is bought with settlements. When an atrocity surfaces, silence is enforced with secrecy clauses. And the people sign thinking it ends there. But silence never ends, it festers. Just like the convent, silence becomes a contract, binding not just the speaker but the generations that follow. This is why corruption survives centuries. Not because evil men are powerful, but because silence keeps them hidden long enough to breed successors. The convent taught us, bury one voice, protect the entire system. And this principle still rules. Every time a truth is sealed, an institution survives. Every time a voice is buried, the machinery grows stronger. You want to know why the world feels controlled? Why corruption always seems one step ahead? Because silence, once weaponized, multiplies. But here's the fracture. Silence, when broken, does not release softly. It erupts. Think of every whistleblower who risked everything. Think of every protest born from decades of swallowed injustice. The eruption is violent because the silence was suffocating. The buried do not rise gently. They claw their way back. And when they do, the entire structure trembles. This is why institutions fear truth more than bullets. A bullet kills a body. Truth kills control. And the girls of 1709 knew this, whether consciously or not. Their muffled screams beneath the convent floors were not just death cries. They were warnings, vibrations that shook the stones, echoes that carried through centuries to reach you now. You are hearing them. You are feeling them. And now the choice is yours. Continue swallowing silence or become part of the eruption. The convent was never isolated. It was a node in a network. To think of it as a lone aberration is to misunderstand how power works. Silence was currency, and currency moves through hands. The bishop who ordered bricks thick enough to mute screams was not acting alone. His silence bought the governor's favor, and the governor's silence secured Paris approval. This was not one crime. It was a chain of complicity stretching from swampy Louisiana all the way to gilded salons of France. And yet, woven through these political bargains was something darker. Reports surfaced of envoys attending midnight gatherings in the convent's basement. Men of state kneeling beside nuns, reciting words that belonged to no mass Rome ever sanctioned. What brought these two spheres, church and state, into ritual together? Power. Always power. And the silence of the buried was their binding oath. Those girls were not only victims, they were seals. And their sealed mouths kept unholy alliances intact. Do you think it coincidence that New Orleans, founded on this silence, became the city of veils and masks? Even its celebrations, its carnivals, its parades, are built on layers of concealment. What was hidden beneath the convent seeped into the city's bloodstream. Catholic on the surface, something else beneath. The whispers claim that church leaders struck bargains not only with politicians, but with occult societies that sailed in under the flag of commerce. Men who trafficked bodies across oceans also trafficked symbols, rituals, and texts. Silence was their insurance. A girl who spoke, who revealed too much about what she saw, became a liability. And liabilities are always disposed of. In that context, the buried girls were not anomalies, they were necessities. The silence of the convent was not just about protecting morality. It was about protecting contracts written in shadows, alliances too volatile to ever see the light. But here's the paradox: silence hides, but it also reveals. Every buried voice creates an absence, a hole, and if you know where to look, the hole points directly to the truth. Why were so many convent records lost during fires? Why were shipping logs mysteriously incomplete? Why do modern archives list illness for so many young deaths without specifying symptoms? Because those holes, those silences, were patches over a truth too corrosive. And yet the more patches you see, the clearer the shape beneath becomes. The convent was not protecting faith, it was protecting a cabal of power holders who understood the psychology of silence as ritual. And here's where the myth becomes history. In their minds, silence was not absence, it was an entity. Something you could feed, something you could wield. They did not just fear silence breaking. They feared silence itself starving. Which means the buried girls were offerings. Their screams kept the entity alive. Imagine the psychology of those in control. To the outside world, they were holy and dignified, symbols of stability in a volatile colony. But in hidden chambers, they turned girls into conduits, forcing their silence into the soil until it radiated back as strength. That is the core of forbidden knowledge. Pain transmuted into power, silence weaponized into domination. And you must ask yourself, if this system worked so effectively, why would it ever be abandoned? It wasn't. It evolved. Today's institutions don't need to bury girls beneath convents. They bury whistleblowers beneath lawsuits. They bury citizens beneath surveillance. They bury you beneath distraction. But the engine is the same, silence transformed into fuel. And if you think this is only metaphor, remember, the people of New Orleans still claim the convent is haunted. Haunted not by saints, but by the residue of silence itself. Walk by at night and you don't just feel fear, you feel watched, measured, as though silence itself is checking to see if you belong to it. And here lies the forbidden layer, the one that costs you something to even hear. Silence is not merely a tactic. It is a control system older than any convent, older than Rome, older than organized religion itself. Ancient cultures knew of it. Some worshipped it as a god, some feared it as a curse. Silence is the perfect parasite. It does not demand temples. It demands obedience. It feeds not on prayers but on the truths you choke back. The convent of 1709 was simply one shrine among thousands, a modern altar to an ancient force. Every girl buried alive was a sacrifice to this parasite. And the parasite is still here. When you hesitate to speak, when you choke on the words burning inside you, you are feeding it. Do you see it now? You are not just hearing a story. You are meeting an ancient enemy, one that wears the robes of priests, the masks of politicians, and the algorithms of machines. And the question is, will you remain its host or will you break free? You felt it before, the choke in your throat when you wanted to speak and didn't. That is the parasite at work. The same silence that turned the convent into a tomb is the same silence that stalks you now. Institutions have simply refined the ritual. Instead of bricks, they use shame. Instead of barred windows, they use ridicule. Instead of burial, they use algorithms that bury truth beneath endless noise. You may think yourself free, but ask, How often do you censor your own thoughts before they ever leave your lips? That hesitation is not weakness. It is conditioning. The same conditioning the girls of New Orleans resisted until the ground swallowed them. They chose to speak, and for that they became sacrifices. Their courage was punished so that your obedience could be perfected centuries later. And here you sit listening. Their story has found you. Do you feel the weight of that inheritance? But here's what they never wanted you to realize. Silence breaks. It always breaks. Stones crack. Records resurface. Ghosts walk. The parasite feeds, yes, but it is fragile when confronted. One whisper becomes a roar. One story becomes unstoppable. That is why I am telling you this now. And that is why you are still here, despite the unease crawling in your veins. Because something in you knows you were meant to hear this. That parasite you've carried all your life, it can starve. But only if you make the choice. You don't break silence by noise. You break it by truth. The buried girls of 1709 were not erased. They became an infection in the system. They are why whispers still haunt New Orleans. They are why the story survived. Because silence can suppress the voice, but it cannot erase the echo. And you listening now are that echo's next vessel. So I will ask you, will you keep feeding silence or will you starve it? If you feel the weight of this descent, if you see through the masks now, then I want you to write in the comments, I bury silence before silence buries me. Write it twice. Not once, twice. Because repetition is ritual, and rituals cut deeper than noise. When you do this, you are not only locking yourself into this transformation, you are signaling to others that you've joined the unmasking. This is not just engagement. This is resistance. And resistance spreads like plague. Think of the buried girls, sealed in the walls with only their last breaths. Think of how their silence has reached across centuries to find you. Now imagine what your refusal to remain silent could echo into the future. This is where history and myth merge, because the parasite only wins if you refuse to speak. But you must also understand, the enemy has evolved. The convent walls are digital now. The silence comes in the form of distraction, of fake debates, of illusions carefully engineered to keep you docile. They want you staring at shadows while the real architecture of control remains untouched. That's why this channel exists. Not for entertainment, not for stories alone, but as a fracture in the wall. Every episode is a crack in the silence they built around you. And yes, I will say this once, subscribe. Not as a number, not as a click, but as a refusal. Because if you've come this far, then you already know, you are not here by accident. This is the rabbit hole you were meant to find. And together, those who refuse silence form the one thing the parasite cannot endure, a chorus. A choir of voices too loud to be buried, too relentless to be patched over. And now we close where we began, in the convent where girls were buried alive for breaking silence. Their screams shook the stones, but history tells us those screams were erased. I tell you they were not. You heard them tonight. Every image, every word you've carried through this descent, that was their scream reaching through centuries. The silence did not win because you are here. But know this, knowledge comes with weight. You cannot unknow what you now carry. This parasite of silence, this system older than empires, has marked you. Either you continue as its host, or you starve it with every truth you dare to speak. That choice is the line between the buried and the awakened. The convent was their tomb, but let it be your threshold. Step across it now before silence swallows you whole. Because once you've heard the scream beneath the stones, you are no longer innocent. You are dangerous. And that is exactly what they always feared.